Hello and welcome to another Debating Europe Citizens panel with me, Joe Litabarsky. I'm the editor-in-chief of Debating Europe, and today we're going to be talking about the war in Ukraine and some of the ways it's spilled over into areas impacting citizens and civil society across the EU, from the so-called information war to refugees, to energy, to cost of living, food, to popular support for Ukraine, and so on. Before we get into that, though, let me introduce my panel today. First of all, we have Luca. Luca, hello. Can you just tell us where you're calling us from?
Hi, everyone. I'm Luca from Milan in Italy.
Welcome, Luca. And next up, we have Joanna. Welcome, Joanna. If you could just introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm calling from Warsaw, Poland.
Hi, Joanna. Welcome. And last but not least, we have Samina. Hello, Samina.
Hello. I'm calling from Brussels.
Fantastic. Okay, so with the introductions out of the way, let's start the discussion with a bit of context from me first. So first of all, Debating Europe is a project of the think tank Friends of Europe. And today's panel is the first in a series of discussions with citizens and civil society representatives that we're holding ahead of Friends of Europe's flagship State of Europe Roundtable in October. So the purpose of today's talk is hopefully to generate some ideas, some comments and questions that we can put to policymakers and experts at State of Europe for them to react to. And today's panel is linked to session 1 at State of Europe, which is titled Redefining the Toolkit of Modern Warfare. Let me read the description of the session, and I've already told all of the panelists that if they disagree, they can absolutely disagree. I'd be very happy to hear that. But let's start with how the session is going to be defined. It's defined in the program for State of Europe. So the war in Ukraine has given rise to a new whole of economy, whole of society approach to warfare. It is redefining the roles of government, multilateralism, and non-state actors such as the private sector and civil society. We've witnessed a range of responses to the war, from economic sanctions and the withdrawal of business activities from Russia to private sector actors providing internet and digital support to Ukrainians on the front line. I think this is Elon Musk and his Starlink, and entrepreneurial alliances between hackers and cybersecurity experts to tackle disinformation and protect citizens. The speed of economic sanctions to prevent all-out war was perhaps a defining moment for a more effective form of multilateralism. However, future analysis may struggle to separate the impact of these deterrents from the actions of non-state actors. Now, I'm going to translate that. It's very complicated, and it's not just state against state. It is there's an information war, if you want to frame it that way. There's a financial war, sanctions, economic, all, there's a disinformation. It's incredibly complicated with lots and lots of different actors. So I'm going to put it to the panel. First of all, do you agree? Maybe you completely reject the way that I've just framed it there, but also thinking particularly about the war in Ukraine. In what areas do you think that citizens and civil society groups have the greatest positive impact? I'll just throw it at the group and see who wants to kind of kick off the discussion. So who wants to I know it's a big one, but you can take it in any direction you want. Who wants to kick off our discussion and kind of bring some ideas to the table? Joanna, please.
Thank you once again for having me. So I'll be speaking from more Polish perspective. As we know, war changes everything and tests the social responses to migration. There are inherent consequences of it. As a result of the war, almost 3 million of Ukrainians, mostly women, children, and elderly, have already crossed the border into Poland. And such a large migration in such a short time is a test of solidarity, and also a test of efficient of the structures and insufficient of the state. So on the 27th of March, state structures were just getting organized, surprised and unprepared for the arrival of refugees. So the whole responsibility for rapid responses fell on the Polish society. So we quickly set up food, medical, and closing points. We're also able to positively use the power of social media. For example, Facebook groups were quickly created to organize aid, transport, food, and more. It enables smooth communication between perhaps donors and provisional centers offering support for refugees. If transport perhaps was needed, the problem was solved within a few minutes of such information being posted on Facebook groups. So there was and still is commitment. And we kind of managed to unite because seniors, youth, and students, everyone was and still is willing to help. And finally, after long months at home due to the pandemic, we could feel useful again. It was and still is efficient.
That's really interesting. I think it has been inspirational, the way that civil society has stepped up to help with the, refugees, to host refugees in their homes, to kind of provide support and services and so on. Do you think that, because you said at the beginning that a lot of the burden fell on civil society, the state wasn't prepared. Do you think that's changed, and the Polish state and the European partners have kind of stepped in to support civil society as well? Would you say that you've seen that over the months? Because it's been now month 5 of the war, let's remind ourselves. What's your kind of feeling in terms of how the burden has shifted, and if that support is coming from the Polish state?
The state is getting better. We are definitely more and more organized, and state has organized some transport with humanitarian aid to Ukraine, as well as they organize and help to organize locating refugees here in Poland. But still, I would say, proudly, I would say that the work is on Polish society. The kind of like pioneer, the direction of every action. So it looks like state is just following the further actions of Polish society.
Interesting. And Luca, what's it looking like in Italy? If I put the same question to you, which areas do you think citizens and civil society groups have the greatest positive impact?
I was about to comment on Europe in general, but I think it applies the same to Italy. So I would have said that the area where the most positive impact from civil society is basically the support for refugees and for people fleeing the war. Of course, in Poland, it's much bigger because it's bordering Ukraine. But in general, I think support for refugees and people fleeing the war is really widespread all over Europe, Italy included, and it's very good to see, because maybe it seems one could think it's taken for granted, but apparently it's not. We've seen in the past, so that's really good. And another thing, I think civil society has or could have a positive impact if they were listened to, is voicing peace, because I think in Europe there is a really wide support for peace efforts, which of course doesn't mean fighting tanks with flowers, but in general to try and achieve a de-escalation, a ceasefire, or a peace solution in the end, which I think is very widespread in general, and especially in a few countries, especially maybe in Western Europe in this case. And I think that's another positive impact that comes from civil society. And then maybe there's other potential ones, but I think these ones are the main ones. Maybe there's some shortcoming from the state, especially with respect to refugees in some countries. But I also don't want to cannibalize maybe on other questions. Maybe this will be talked into further detail further on.
Interesting. Okay, so you're, as well as the support that civil society and kind of citizens can give to refugees, which Joanna was talking about, you also bring in this idea of kind of the political engagement, like maybe pushing, keeping momentum, because I suppose, let me put it this way, there is a risk that Ukraine kind of falls off of the front page as well. There's a risk that attention flags, that something else comes along, and that people start talking about, there's all sorts of pressures, and we can kind of talk about some of them, I'm sure we will, from cost of living, energy, to what's happening in the United States with Roe versus Wade, for example. All of these things can demand attention, and rightfully so. But I think, if I'm understanding you, Luca, there is a role for civil society in kind of keeping that political pressure up. Is that what you mean? Have I?
Yeah, I mean, both political pressure, meaning keeping the eyes on the situation, as should be, I think, in general with every war, and maybe in some sense, this is a very peculiar war, but it's also maybe in that respect a privileged one for the amount of attention it's get, which is generally, let's say, good to keep the focus on. But I mean, in terms of what Europeans believe, I think the majority of Europeans, I was reading the results of some polls a few days ago, think there should be also, I'm going to be straightforward here, there should be, in the end, some negotiations to bring peace about. And this is, for instance, I think, completely absent from the political discourse at the top floors, let's say. As well, I think the civil society has played a role in this respect since the very beginning, which I think is positive, because I don't think civil society wants, for instance, an escalation.
Okay. Let's bring Samina in. Would you agree with what you've heard? Is there anything that you wanted to add to the discussion about kind of the role of citizens and civil society groups? Anything that you'd like to highlight?
So I definitely agree with Joanna that civil society was basically responsible for the immediate response to the crisis. But what I would like to add to the discussion is that civil society groups actually contributed a lot to the way governments responded to the crisis. So I could give you an example that some of the NGOs that specialize in diabetes, for example, they collaborated with the government in telling them exactly what they need, where do they need, how to send specific medicine, what channels to use to Ukraine. So also it's important to collaborate and show them, because they're on the field, so they're in contact with the people, whereas governments sometimes are disconnected. So it's important to build that link between civil society groups and what we're going to do on a bigger scale.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. The idea that you can the governments risk, if they don't listen to civil society groups, they don't listen to citizens, they can kind of be a bit disconnected from what's happening. And they, for example, to bring it back to what Joanna was saying at the beginning, maybe they don't know what civil society is doing and what support they need. And so building those links and making sure that the government is listening, I think is an important lesson. Hopefully they are. You didn't, all of you, I mean, we've set out some kind of ways that civil society has stepped up, and I think that's really, really interesting, but nobody mentioned kind of disinformation or information, the kind of so-called information war, which is one of the things I set out in the introduction. Maybe Luca did a little bit in terms of the kind of the point about the political pressure and the kind of support for negotiated peace and so on. But I mean, I'm going to ask you all very bluntly about this in the next question, which is because maybe this links to what Samina just said as well, in terms of people on the ground kind of having access to information or kind of knowing things, being connected in a way that maybe not everyone in society is, and they can, everyone can add kind of a voice. So do you think citizens and civil society groups, for example, reach audiences inside closed authoritarian societies to counter propaganda and disinformation? It could be through personal networks, it could be through WhatsApp groups, through people that they know, or Telegram, or so on. And what kind of impact can citizens and civil society achieve beyond kind of small and elite opposition groups. I don't know if anyone wants to come in on this, if you disagree with the way the question's framed, or if you have kind of anything to add. Maybe Joanna, we'll start with you, because you began with the last one, the last question. What do you think about the role of civil society and citizens in this kind of information space? What do you think about that?
That's a very interesting question, especially right now when actually major social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram are being banned in Russia. So the spread of misinformation and, I would say, propaganda is getting bigger in those countries such as Belarus and Russia. And the long distance propaganda founded by Kremlin is forcing total submission of the Russian people. But I would like to underline the fact that nobody is born evil. Hatred is learned. So for me, teach the public to think critically, so you will never have to think for them again. So this is not about imposing someone else's rhetoric, but about providing them with the tools to decide for themselves what is wrong or what is right. There is nothing more satisfying actually than achieving something yourself. And we should just provide them with tools in the term of education. So civil society could be a way to learn those societies, to think critically. Educating the young leaders of such as community gives hope that things can change. So, and they will definitely spread the message to others because they have more links and connections within their own society. So in my opinion, we should be aiming for those young leaders or candidates that would spread the word further. And organizing dedicated programs for such societies could be one solution. But yeah, another question is how should they be reached by European Union or us more democratic countries?
I think this is a really important question, and it speaks to what Luca was saying in the first kind of round of discussion, because I don't think relations between Russia and the West have been as bad as this. I mean, I'm certainly not in my lifetime, but perhaps even going back into the Cold War, you had dialogue and forum. You had, there were. And I understand the sensitivities of this, where there is a war happening as we speak, but it feels like there are very few forums for kind of discussions or the kind of negotiation that Luca was talking about. And even during the Cold War, that wasn't necessarily the case. There were kind of places where you could have these sort of deliberations and where you could try to project soft power of the sort that Joanna was talking about. How about, because obviously clearly a negotiated settlement of the kind that Luca was talking about requires both sides to negotiate. Okay, and let's not pretend that Russia is coming to the negotiating table at the moment, but there doesn't also seem to be these channels for kind of, the question I asked you was, how can you reach audiences inside closed authoritarian societies to counter propaganda and disinformation? Well, Twitter and Facebook have been banned in Russia. How do we even speak if there's this kind of digital iron curtain? I don't know, Luca, what do you think? You brought up this question of negotiated peace.
Yeah, let me start from why I didn't mention social media and information versus disinformation. The first one, because you were talking about positive impact. And I'm not so sure that the impact is always positive, because it's an amazing opportunity that during a war, you can talk literally to people in Ukraine and even to people in Russia, and they can talk with each other. It's a huge opportunity, but also a huge threat. So I wasn't sure it was a positive impact. But yes, I do think it's important, and social media and the internet are a great way to try and reach to people inside authoritarian regimes. Also, people who don't speak English, because we have functions of translating comments or tweets or YouTube comments that work quite well. I can speak to people who only speak Russian or Ukrainian. and they can talk to me. And I think it's a huge opportunity. But of course, as you were saying, if regime shuts down communication channels as it's happening in Russia, then it's going to be hard. Some people can use a VPN, but I don't think it's something everyone can use. So I think that's why I think it's important to keep some channels on. Also during the Cold War, I mean, Russia was not in the same bloc as most Western European countries, but for instance, universities or professors or sports people, I'm not talking about sports teams such as a football team that is representing the Russian nation, then I can understand that you don't want that in a competition. But sports people like tennis players who were banned from Wimbledon, for instance, or professors or artists, writers, and so on and so forth. I think it's important that there is some channel of communication, at least with intellectuals, to try and break into the curtain, because otherwise those people within those countries will be completely alienated from what is outside. And I think this also applies to negotiation. Of course, negotiation is not something that you meet once and you sign something and then it's done. It's something you work on for a long time, and it doesn't necessarily have to start from the same position or from a shared view from in the beginning, but it's something you have to work on to break through.
You need to have that dialogue. Okay, Samina, what do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think we're being utopian or unrealistic? What are your thoughts?
It's like you read my mind. I find this question very difficult because in theory, I think, yes, we should focus on education and having that dialogue. But in practice, if it's the case of Russia, I think you need very, very, very brave people to come forward. And it's scary in such an uncertain time, and you don't know if you can pay for food next month, to also risk your own safety and your family's safety. So I understand why a lot of people have, in a way, given up and fled or fought. But it's a very difficult decision to take, and I think the decision would be in the hands of young people, because we are the future generation. Also, we are more educated. But I also sympathize with them that it's a very scary thought to be able to say, I want to fight for my country and I think this is right for whatever they want to fight for, when they know that their safety is at risk.
Indeed. Let's not forget that there is a risk of a prison sentence, I think 10 or 15 years in prison, potentially big fines and custodial sentences introduced recently. So it is, you're absolutely right, Samina, to point that out. Okay, let's move on to the last question. Actually, maybe this links nicely to the final question, which is where should governments encourage or discourage citizens and civil society initiatives, as they have done regarding foreign fighters, for example? And there is a big question of foreign, this is something citizens can do. They can go to fight in Ukraine as people did during the Spanish Civil War, for example. You have kind of foreign legions and volunteers and so on. But is that something that governments should be encouraging, or is it rather something they should be discouraging, trying to avoid this happening? Illicit financial flows, arms smuggling to conflicts, and of course, there's, we've seen examples of people crowdfunding donations to Ukraine. I saw recently crowdfunding of drones, for example, to Ukraine. So all sorts of things like this are happening. And then this question, what makes one war different from another, or one side deserving of assistance? This is a huge question, and it may be that you have no idea, but do you have any thoughts about this? How do we decide what governments, I mean, at the beginning, Joanna was saying, oh, look, on refugees, the government can kind of step in and offer support, and I think we all agree that that is a positive place where governments can kind of come in and provide that support. But how do we decide what is positive, what governments should be encouraging and discouraging, particularly when there are these risks that Samina has been talking about? These are people's lives. You don't want to And in a war, it is supposed to be state against state. So it becomes confusing when citizens and civil society are being involved like this. On the other hand, there is a huge kind of desire to help, to take part, to assist, to kind of give support. So I guess this is an ethical or a philosophical question. I don't know. Does anyone want to kick us off? Like, this is tough, guys.
I have thought about it before. If I can start from the end, so what makes this war different and this war more worthy of attention or support? I think we've been taught that there's like these two factors, like whether someone is a victim, it's more deserving than someone being an aggressor. And then we've been taught that if a country is democratic or represents a certain set of values, then it's more worthy. So this way we've been able to justify wars where the West was the aggressor, like in Iraq, and other, or I don't know, for instance, because the values were not the same, or for instance in Israel, where the country occupying in that case is closer to our values, so we kind of make it work. In the case of Ukraine, it's being invaded and it's arguably closer to our value compared to Russia, even though I don't think it's a full-fledged democracy, but it's still closer to our value. So both conditions are met, and that's why there's this focus, even though I would say that the people are worthy of assistance regardless of all of this. And arguably, for instance, Afghans have had the same right to be assisted as Ukrainian, but we left them. So there's some hypocrisy there. But to come to what should be encouraged and what not by state actors compared to civil society, my personal opinion, but I'm open, of course, to debate, is that it's basically anything that would be legal in your own country. So if civil society want to come and help, or want to crowdfund something, whatever it is, or want to send help over or host refugees, anything, I think this is right, and why not encourage that? I think it's different when we talk in terms of foreign fighters, because I think in general states have the monopoly of violence, and there's a reason for that. And so people going there as volunteers expose themselves to risk, but they also expose themselves, for instance, to become prisoners and become tokens of so the enemy can leverage on them a lot more. So I think that's where it should be discouraged. And in some case, the state should anyway step in, even in the other domains. For instance, when it comes to refugees, it's great that civil society is so engaged and helps, but the state should always check, because, for instance, people smugglers and people who don't have the right intention in some cities have been found to pretend to want to host refugees, and then that's not what they want to do. And many of these people are women and children. So we should, I think, encourage anything that does not involve direct violence from private citizens, but keep an eye also on the rest, so that everything runs smoothly and that civil society brings the best possible contribution.
Interesting. I do think that this discussion, to me, highlights how murky and kind of grey this is, and how important I think it is to have this kind of discussion. Because if we set out at the beginning, look, war in the 21st century is complicated. It is not state actor against state actor. It is much more complex. Well, there are risks in that complexity. For example, I think this is interesting what Luca just said about, don't encourage things that will put citizens and civil society at risk, for example. Samina, you were talking about the risks that the Russian civil society faces. I think, that it's really important to highlight that. And then there are also risks that maybe Western civil society or European civil society faces as well, if they kind of overstep some of the lines which Luca was talking about just now. Do you think that's right, that a good principle is civil society can support in anything that is legal in their country, and should be discouraged from doing things that put themselves or others at risk. Is that a good principle, would you say?
I think it's a good principle, and I wouldn't say government should encourage foreign fighters, not at all. But if somebody wants to do that, they should be well informed. I don't think a government can necessarily stop somebody's own will. You can't say it's illegal because they would find a way to do it, but they should be fully informed if they would like to fight for another state. They could do that if they know. But one more thing I want to highlight is in relation to public health. I think, I don't know if you know, but because of the supply, a lot of treatment is not sent to Russia. And a lot of pharma companies are not willing to send it because it is Russia and they care about the way they are seen in the world. So they're not going to help. And I think in situations like that, governments should definitely help the citizens that are at risk, regardless of where they're from, because at the end of the day, this is a war between two states. In my view, sometimes the head of the state against another head of the state, and then there are people that are at risk that are not connected to the war at all. So governments should help each other, even though they might be at war.
And do you think that should be unilateral? So I mean, by this, I mean, like we all know, for example, there is a dispute around food at the moment. Even if, for example, food shipments continue to be held up for whatever reason, do you think that the kind of, because I mean, what you're talking about is medicine shipments to Russia, medical devices, all sorts of things which might be difficult to source in Russia, and it's going to have an impact on people's health, of course, clearly. Should there be a kind of unilateral move? Look, let's take the kind of high ground. It should be medicine should always go, food should always go. It doesn't make a difference, is in your opinion?
For sure. I think there are certain rules in war which have not been respected in this war, from my understanding, but that should be one of the unspoken rules. If somebody is in need of treatment and is not involved in the war or food, they should be granted access to it.
Yeah, no, I think this is really, particularly this is interesting in the case of self-sanctioning, which is where there is no, there might not be an official export ban on medical devices, but some companies might be withdrawing from Russia, from Russian markets, from pressure from civil society campaigns in part, or the risk of kind of reputational blowback, which is really interesting and brings in again this the complexity of the situation. Okay, we're almost finished. I'm going to give the last word to Joanna. What are your thoughts on kind of what we've said here? Some of that, I mean, the takeaway that I have is that it's enormously complicated. I think it's good to talk about it, but I think that I don't have the answers. I think it is something that we can only reach through discussion and through deliberation. But what are your kind of thoughts? What do you want to kind of add or respond to?
Yes, indeed, it's very complicated. And from my opinion, we should focus on long-term actions and think in advance. So I will mention also more Polish perspective. So with the large influx of refugees from Ukraine to Poland, we can surely predict that there will be disagreements between the nations. And at the same time, we must prepare Polish society for transformation into, I would say, bi-national nation. So the first large group of Ukrainian refugees arrived in Poland during the illegal annexion of Crimea. Since then, Ukrainians have become a part of Polish society, and it will not be different in the future. So we should definitely encourage Polish society to assimilate the newcomers, and I think the government can play a big role in that. So show that despite the turbulent history between our nations, because we have and still hold some disagreements, we have more in common than it divides us. So the state should encourage joint initiatives that help to unite both peoples. So, for example, recently we hold Warsaw Kyiv Pride Parade in Warsaw. It was happening last Saturday. So let me say it more clear: we share a common future.
Okay, that's a nice point to end on. I'm going to wrap this up. My panelists, please stay with me, because I hope some of the complexity of the discussion has kind of got you thinking, has got you in terms of kind of some comments and ideas and thoughts or criticism that you can put to State of Europe, to some of the panelists, the politicians, the experts who are going to be there. For the those watching on YouTube and on Facebook, thank you so much for following, and I hope you can get involved in one of these citizens panels in the future as well. We'll have details in the show notes, and thank you again to the panelists for taking part.